few days ago, I watched the season finale of a show called Our Flag Means Death, which is a quirky little rom-com about pirates. I am a sucker for a love story, and I also had a pirate phase in high school that never really ended, and as a result, this show was right up my alley, and I've been obsessed with it because I have a hard time enjoying things a normal amount. I wanted to make this video to do a brief little historical overview of some of the story beats that happen in the show, as well as some of the characters, and just kind of talk about the little nods to history that are sprinkled throughout the show as a whole. When it comes to this show, there is a lot to talk about queerness and about queer history, not to mention the costumes, because oh my, the costumes. But I feel like there are people who are better suited to talk about those topics, so I am just going to touch very briefly on them in this video, but I am really looking forward to seeing what other creators put out as far as video essays and the show in the next couple of months. However, due to my pirate phase that never truly ended, I have a whole bunch of fun pirate facts stored away in my brain that I would like to share with you, as well as some other things that I read after I finished watching this show that recontextualize some of the things that happened, and it's just really neat and I want to talk about it. From here on out though, there are going to be spoilers for Our Flag Means Death, so please do not blame me if you get spoiled and haven't finished the series yet, but I highly recommend watching it without spoilers in its entirety as it's fantastic. I also want to be explicitly clear that I am not trying to tear down this show for being historically accurate or inaccurate. I love this show, and I just want to celebrate all of the little allusions to history that are scattered amongst the various stories and characters and things like that. I want to talk about those and also maybe make a few predictions for season 2 at the same time. So let's jump into it, shall we? Many characters that appear in this show are based off of real historical figures, while others are based off of the myths and folklore of the 17th and 18th centuries. We know a lot about these historical figures due to a book called A General History of Pirates that was written in 1724 by a mystery author who used the pen name Captain Johnson. This book explores the lives of pirates that were active during the golden age of piracy, and while some might consider these as biographies, there are some artistic licenses that are taken with some of these historical figures, so I would take everything in this book with a grain of salt, although it does contain some really interesting historical nuggets. Interestingly, this book would inspire future authors to write about pirates, including Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island, as well as J.M. Barrie, who wrote Captain Hook into Peter Pan. At one point, the protagonist of this show appears to be flipping through a copy of this book and even lands on a picture of the historical figure that he is portraying, which I thought was a really cool little Easter egg. Speaking of protagonists, our primary protagonist in Our Flag Means Death is a dandy who goes by the name of Stede Bonnet, otherwise known as the Gentleman Pirate.
Traditionally, piracy is a culture of abuse. Floggings, keel haulings, and my thought is, why?
As we will see, there is no true exact historical representation between the historical figure and what we see on screen, but that is not what the writers of this show were trying to do, and also that sort of thing just kind of doesn't belong in a series like this. I actually don't want a 100% accurate historical depiction of Stede Bonnet or Blackbeard, as they weren't very good people, and that doesn't make for a good rom-com. I want the writers of this show to take some artistic liberties and create interesting characters to go on with an interesting story for television. But with this being said, there is a lot of overlap between the Stede Bonnet in the television show and the Stede Bonnet that is characterized in Captain Johnson's book. Our mysterious author states that Stede Bonnet suffered from a disorder of his mind, which was likely partially due to the fact that one of his sons died shortly before he put out to sea, but also he suffered from what Captain Johnson refers to as a discomfort in a married state, which the show writers included as not only an episode title, but also as a line of dialogue.
It was me. I was just uncomfortable in a married state.
The fact that this line of dialogue exists shows that someone in the writer's room probably at some point sat down and at the very least skimmed Stede Bonnet's section in A General History of Pirates, and I think that's really cool. By the way, if you are interested in reading Captain Johnson's book in its entirety online for free, you can through Project Gutenberg, which I will provide a link in the description. Captain Johnson actually tells us quite a bit about who Stede Bonnet was as a person, including how he was an avid reader and was a pretty big bibliophile, which we also see reflected in the show with the large library and the fact that we often see him reading. He also notes how unusual Stede Bonnet was as a pirate, as most pirates conquer their first ship, they overrun their first ship, and that becomes their primary vessel, whereas Stede Bonnet had his ship, the Revenge, custom built, not to mention the fact that he actually paid his crew a wage. I think one of the most interesting and prominent historical events that occurred in Stede Bonnet's life that was adapted for the show is the injuries that he sustained after an unpleasant run-in with the Spanish.
Así tratamos a los piratas.
Historically, the real Stede Bonnet did not unwittingly board a Spanish vessel. However, he did sustain very serious injuries and lost half of his crew in a battle with the Spaniards. After the battle, Stede Bonnet and his ship the Revenge limped their way to Port Nassau, and there met Captain Hornigold and his underling, one Captain Blackbeard, to whom he ceded control of the Revenge for a period of time as he recovered from his wounds. We also know from a source that is not Captain Johnson, but rather from a merchant ship that was actually boarded by the crew of the Revenge, that while it was under the control of Blackbeard, Stede Bonnet was seen on board, often in his night clothes wandering around on deck. Historically, Blackbeard took control of this ship for some time, conducting piracy against several other ships, notably with Bonnet still on board. Speaking of Blackbeard, we actually know very, very little about him and his early life. However, the show does a really good job at giving Ed an interesting backstory and characteristics that stem from his fictional childhood. We also see Ed be more soft than how he is traditionally recorded in the history books. However, this is a romantic comedy. Blackbeard is recorded as being bloodthirsty and cruel. However, the show creates a complex divide between Blackbeard and Ed, a guy who is so beyond board with the pirate's life that when the audience is first getting to know him, he appears almost to be suicidal.
I shouldn't be bored, I'm fucking Blackbeard.
Well, as bored as you might be, if you don't make a decision soon, we're gonna fucking die.
Ooh, now there's an idea. I haven't done that yet. Haven't died yet, have I? Maybe we just try that.
This is one of my favorite depictions of Blackbeard in media, as they address not only the legend of Blackbeard, but also kind of take some creative license and imagine him as a real person. In most of the media where I've seen Blackbeard as a character, he tends to appear as a villain, but in this series, he's far more compelling and complex. Being portrayed by Taika Waititi probably also helps this a lot. The first time we see Ed, we see him as a storied, hyperbolic version of himself. Historically, he is described as being a very large man with an absolute mass of black hair and a large black bushy beard. Shocking, I know. But he is also described as having tied lit wicks to the braids at the ends of his beard and his hair, so that he always kind of looked like he was slightly on fire and smoking. And the first time Blackbeard is really mentioned, it is in a story being told by a crew member, and he's describing Blackbeard in a very similar fashion.
Wait, so you're saying Blackbeard's head is made of smoke?
When he needs it to be.
And his eyes glow?
Yes.
We see reflections of the historical figure Blackbeard in Ed, and while the character is a little bit more tentative about killing, it is shown, especially towards the end of the season, that if he so desires it, he is more than willing to go to extreme and violent ends.
No, please!
Our Flag Means Death also showcases other pirates from the same era, including the likes of Calico Jack, Israel or Izzy Hands, and the legendary Spanish Jackie. John Rackham, otherwise known as Calico Jack, is portrayed by Will Arnett in this series, and he only shows up in one episode, and his entire purpose is essentially to cause conflict between Stede and Blackbeard, widow a seagull named Olivia, and die by cannon fire and a hex that was put on him by a man named Mr. Buttons.
Nobody messes with Calico Jack!
Calico Jack is played for comedy and, like I mentioned, also to cause conflict between our two main characters. But he was a real pirate who was active at the same time as Blackbeard and ended his piracy career by being hanged at Port Royal in 1720. The character Izzy Hands is another kind of antagonist in the series, as his entire purpose is also to cause conflict between Stede and Bonnet, but he was also based off of a real person by the name of Israel Hands. Calico Jack and Israel Hands are also entries in Captain Johnson's General History of Pirates. And interestingly, the entry about Israel Hands was used to create one of the members of Long John Silver's crew in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. At one point, Blackbeard is recorded as having shot Israel Hands in the knee, giving him a permanent walking disability.
I used to be an adventurer like you. Then I took an arrow in the knee.
I don't know if they've decided to axe that in the show and instead go for the whole pinky thing, but that's the thing that happened. Another interesting thing about Israel Hands is that in 1717, the year that Our Flag Means Death is supposedly takes place, he is only supposed to be about 16 or 17 years old. But the show has done a really great job at playing around with the idea of age and how hard the pirate lifestyle is on people and how it physically ages them, as we see in the conversation with Jim and Spanish Jackie.
Guess my age.
I don't know. 50?
25.
So within the logic of the show, Izzy could be a very, very haggard teenager, and I kind of love that. Speaking of Spanish Jackie, however, she is not as qualifiable as the previous two men that I mentioned. All of the people I've mentioned so far, we know for a fact, either due to primary resources or what have you, that they definitely existed at some point in history. However, Spanish Jackie is a little bit more of a legend than an actual historical figure. But with that being said, I really liked how they played around with her character, and I really loved Leslie Jones' portrayal of her. That woman looks like she was built to play a tough pirate lady, and it was fantastic. And I really hope to see more of her in hopefully future seasons.
I actually thought you were kind of mad at me, if I'm honest. Why would Jackie be mad?
Ships play a fundamental role as not only a location for the series to take place, but also as a vessel, pun intended, for storytelling. The audience also takes part in a lot of shipping. We know quite a lot about what life was like for seamen in the 18th century, and regardless of if you were under the employ of one of the great navies of the time or if you were privately employed, life was hard. Disease, conflict, scurvy, and all other manner of unpleasantries awaited anybody who chose their career on the sea. But piracy offered opportunities for many people of color who were escaping enslavement or prejudice, women, and as so wonderfully illustrated throughout the course of this show, people who might not adhere to the societal expectations of 18th century gender and sexuality. Matelotage was a French term that referred to the same-sex civil union between two seamen, including pirates, in the 17th and 18th centuries. Some historians believe it was just two bros who lived together and shared all of their economic assets and were just really good friends. But I think it's far more comparable to same-sex marriage than some historians are willing to admit, especially as we have evidence of at least one couple entering this sort of civil union with romantic interests in mind. Hiding one's gender to either fly under the radar or to earn the respect of the primarily male crewmates of a ship is also something that we see in Our Flag Means Death, and is also quite frequent in the historical record. When we first see Jim, a non-binary character, they are on the lam and have donned a false nose and beard in order to hide their true identity. Historically, the dread female pirate Anne Bonny frequently dressed in masculine clothing in order to fly under the radar or, as I mentioned, to earn the respect of her male counterparts aboard the various ships that she served on. The representation of queer relationships and the non-binary character played by the non-binary actor Vico Ortiz is a huge draw to this show for so many people because it's a show about piracy, but it also feels like the perfect vessel, pun intended, to explore these types of relationships. Pirate ships were places where people who didn't fit the expected social mold of the time were more free to live and present themselves as they pleased. We don't really know what sort of relationships these historical figures had, but I think it's pretty safe to say that a lot of them probably had intimate relationships with members of the same sex. Also, for the sake of the show, I don't really care if the relationship is 100% historically accurate or not, as David Jenkins has just made a compelling love story. Even if it's not historically accurate, it has such a huge payoff for an audience that is so used to queerbaiting. Also, this is tangentially related, but my local maritime museum has an exhibit coming out in May called Queer at Sea, and I'm really excited about it. Before I jump into my predictions for Season 2 of Our Flag Means Death, I just want to point out two last little scenes in the show that are of historical interest. The first of these two scenes that I want to talk about is the scene in which Blackbeard and Stede have been captured by the English, and Stede is about to be executed by a firing squad. In a desperate attempt to save him, Blackbeard screams out the words, "Act of Grace."
Act of grace!
This is brought up very suddenly, and at this point in the show we have no context for what those words mean, but before we as the audience have a chance to ask, what the hell was that? The show immediately hard cuts to King George telling us what Act of Grace is.
What's the Act of Grace?
I, King George, do hereby proclaim that any pirate who so abandons his life of crime and pledges service to the crown in their war against the Spanish shall be granted amnesty forthwith.
I am not so sure that screaming Act of Grace at the absolute last minute before a firing squad would have actually worked historically, but King George's Act of Grace did in fact pardon the lives of several pirates over the course of the golden age of piracy in the 18th century, including the likes of Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet, although they both immediately returned to their life of piracy pretty much as soon as they could. Just as we see in the finale of Season 1, the historical Bonnet and Blackbeard parted ways around the time of their respective pardons, with Blackbeard marooning several men on a sandbar just off of Topsail Island. The real Stede Bonnet actually returns to the sea under a fake name or alias. He is sometimes referred to as Captain Thomas, and considering how we finished this season with Stede Bonnet faking his death, I really hope that we get to see him play with some fake names for the sake of comedy in the beginning of Season 2. However, the stories of the real Blackbeard and the real Stede Bonnet do not end well. Blackbeard gave his last stand against the British on November 22nd, 1718. Stede Bonnet was captured, and after a very long and drawn-out process, he was finally executed by hanging on December 10th, 18 days after the death of Blackbeard. With that being said, and the emotional turmoil of the season finale notwithstanding, I am hopeful, as this is still a romantic comedy. And I feel like the writers have set up the art of fuckery early enough that they will make some clever, silly escape at the last minute. That's just me being hopeful, though. Overall, though, I just love this show, and I love the pieces of true history that they decided to incorporate in the different characters and in the story itself, and I'm really, really looking forward to season 2. David Jenkins, if you are watching this, thanks for making such a great series, and I'm really looking forward to what else you produce. That's all I've got to say today, really. I got excited about Pyrates, as I am prone to do, but until next time, my friends.